The Only Rose. A short story by Orne Jewett. Just where the village abruptly ended and the green mowing fields began, stood Mrs. Bickford's house, looking down the road with all its windows and topped by two prim chimneys that stood up like ears. It was placed with an end to the road and fronted southward. You could follow a straight path from the gate past the front door and find Mrs. Bickford sitting by the last window of all in the kitchen, unless she were solemnly stepping about, prolonging the stern duties of her solitary housekeeping. One day in early summer, when almost everyone else in Fairfield had put her houseplants out of doors, there were still 3 flower pots on a kitchen windowsill. Mrs. Bickford spent but little time over her rose and geranium and Jerusalem cherry tree, although they had gained a kind of personality born of long association. They rarely undertook to bloom, but had most courageously maintained life in spite of their owner's unsympathetic but conscientious care. Later in the season, she would carry them out of doors and leave them until the time of frosts under the shade of a great apple tree, where they might make the best of what the summer had to give. The afternoon sun was pouring in. The Jerusalem cherry tree drooped its leaves in the heat and looked pale, when a neighbor, Miss Pendexter, came in from the next house, but one to make a friendly call. As she passed the parlor with its shut blinds and the sitting room, also shaded carefully from the light, she wished, as she had done many times before, that somebody beside the owner might have the pleasure of living in and using so good and pleasant a house. Mrs. Bickford always complained of having so much care, even while she valued herself intelligently upon having the right to do as she pleased with one of the best houses in Fairfield. Miss Pendexter was a cheerful, even gay little person, who always brought a pleasant flurry of excitement, and usually had a genuine though small piece of news to tell, or some new aspect of already received information. Mrs. Bickford smiled as she looked up to see this sprightly neighbor coming. She had no gift at entertaining herself, and was always glad, as one might say, to be taken off her own hands. Miss Pendexter smiled back, as if she felt herself to be equal to the occasion. "How be you today?" the guest asked kindly as she entered the kitchen. "Why, what a sight of flowers, Miss Bickford! What be you going to do with them all?" Mrs. Bickford wore a grave expression as she glanced over her spectacles. "My sister's boy fetched 'em over," she answered. "You know my sister Parsons a great hand to raise flowers, and this boy takes after her. He said his mother thought the garden never looked handsomer, and she picked me these to send over. They was sending a team to Westbury for some fertilizer to put on the land, and he come with the men, and stopped to eat his dinner along o' me. He's been growing fast, and looks peaked. I expect Sister Liza thought the ride, this pleasant day, would do him good. Liza sent word for me to come over and pass some days next week, but it ain't so that I can." "Why, it's a pretty time of year to go off and make a little visit," suggested the neighbor encouragingly. "I ain't got my sitting-room chamber carpet taken up yet," sighed Mrs. Bickford. "I do feel condemned. I might have done it today, but it was all at end when I saw Tommy coming. There, he's a likely boy, and so relished his dinner. I happen to be well prepared. I don't know, but he's my favorite of that family. Only I've been sittin' here thinkin' since he went, and I can't remember that I ever was so belated with my spring cleaning." "'Twas owing to the weather," explained Miss Pendexter. "None of us could be so smart as common this year. Not even the lazy ones that always get one room done the 1st of March, and brag of it to others' shame, and then never let on when they do the rest." The two women laughed together cheerfully. Mrs. Bickford had put up the wide leaf of her large table between the windows and spread out the flowers. She was sorting them slowly into 3 heaps. "Why, I do declare if you haven't got a rose in bloom yourself!" exclaimed Miss Pendexter abruptly, as if the bud had not been announced weeks before, and its progress regularly commented upon. "Ain't it a lovely rose? Why, Miss Bickford—" "Yes'm, it's out today," said Mrs. Bickford with a somewhat plaintive air. "I'm glad you come in so as to see it." The bright flower was like a face. Somehow, the beauty and life of it were surprising in the plain room, like a gay little child who might suddenly appear in a doorway. Miss Pendexter forgot herself and her hostess, and the tangled mass of garden flowers in looking at the red rose. She even forgot that it was incumbent upon her to carry forward the conversation. Mrs. Bickford was subject to fits of untimely silence, which made her friends anxiously sweep the corners of their minds in search of something to say. But anyone who looked at her now could easily see that it was not poverty of thought that made her speechless, but an overburdening sense of the inexpressible. "Going to make up all your flowers into bouquets? I think the short-stemmed kinds is often pretty in a dish," suggested Miss Pendexter compassionately. "I thought I should make them into 3 bouquets. I wish there weren't quite so many. Sister Eliza's very lavish with her flowers. She's always been a kind sister, too," said Mrs. Bickford vaguely. She was not apt to speak with so much sentiment, and as her neighbor looked at her narrowly, she detected unusual signs of emotion. It suddenly became evident that the 3 nosegays were connected in her mind with her bereavement of 3 husbands, and Miss Pendexter's easily roused curiosity was quieted by the discovery that her friend was bent upon a visit to the burying ground. It was the time of year when she was pretty sure to spend an afternoon there, and sometimes they had taken the walk in company. Miss Pendexter expected to receive the usual invitation, but there was nothing further said at the moment, and she looked again at the pretty rose. Mrs. Bickford aimlessly handled the syringas and flowering almond sprays, choosing them out of the fragrant heap only to lay them down again. She glanced out of the window, then gave Miss Pendexter a long, expressive look. "I expect you're going to carry him over to the burying ground?" inquired the guest in a sympathetic tone. "Yes'm," said the hostess, now well started in conversation and in quite her everyday manner. "You see, I was going over to my brother's folks tomorrow in South Fairfield to pass the day. They said they were going to send over tomorrow to leave a wagon at the blacksmith's, and they'd hitch that to their best chaise so I could ride back very comfortable. You know I have to avoid being out in the morning sun." Miss Pendexter smiled to herself at this moment. She was obliged to move from her chair at the window. The May sun was so hot on her back, for Mrs. Bickford always kept the curtains rolled high up, out of the way, for fear of fading in dust. The kitchen was a blaze of light. As for the Sunday chaise being sent, it was well known that Mrs. Bickford's married brothers and sisters comprehended the truth that she was a woman of property, and had neither chick nor child. So I thought it was a good opportunity to just stop and see if the lot was in good order. Last spring Mr. Wallace's stone hove with the frost, and so I could take these flowers. She gave a sigh. "I ain't one that can bear flowers in a close room. They bring on a headache, but I enjoy 'em as much as anybody to look at, only you never know what to put 'em in. If I could be out in the morning sun, as some do, and keep flowers in the house, I should have me a garden, certain." And she sighed again. "A garden's a sight o' care, but I don't begrudge none of the care I give to mine. I have to scant on flowers so's to make room for pole beans," said Miss Pendexter gaily. She had only a tiny strip of land behind her house, but she always had something to give away and made riches out of her narrow poverty. "A few flowers gives me just as much pleasure as more would," she added. "You get acquainted with things when you've only got 1 or 2 roots. My Sweet Williams is just like folks." "Mr. Bickford was partial to Sweet Williams," said Mrs. Bickford. "I never knew him to take notice of no other sort of flowers. When we'd be over to Eliza's, he'd walk down her garden, and he'd never make no comments until he come to them, and then he'd say, 'Those is Sweet Williams.' How many times I've heard him." "You ought to have a sprig of 'em for his bouquet," suggested Miss Pendexter. "Yes, I've put a sprig in," said her companion. At this moment Miss Pendexter took a good look at the bouquets and found that they were as nearly alike as careful hands could make them. Mrs. Bickford was evidently trying to reach absolute impartiality. "I don't know, but you think it's foolish to tie 'em up this afternoon," she said presently, as she wound the first with a stout string. "I thought I could put 'em in a bucket of water out in the shed, where there's a draught of air, and then I should have all my time in the morning. I shall have a good deal to do before I go. I always sweep the setting room and front entry Wednesdays. I want to leave everything nice, going away for all day so. So I meant to get the flowers out of the way this afternoon. Why, it's most 4:30, ain't it? But I shan't pick the rose till morning. 'Twill be blowed out better then." "The rose?" questioned Miss Pendexter. "Why, are you going to pick that too?" "Yes, I be. I never like to let 'em fade on the bush. There, that's just what's a-troubling me." And she turned to give a long, imploring look at the friend who sat beside her. Miss Pendexter had moved her chair before the table in order to be out of the way of the sun. "I don't seem to know which of 'em ought to have it," said Mrs. Bickford despondently. "I do so hate to make a choice between 'em. They all had their good points, especially Mr. Bickford, and I respected 'em all. I don't know but what I think of one on 'em most as much as I do of the other." "Why, 'tis difficult for you, ain't it?" responded Miss Pendexter. "I don't know's I can offer advice." "No, I suppose not," answered her friend slowly, with a shadow of disappointment coming over her calm face. "I feel sure you would if you could, Abby." Both of the women felt as if they were powerless before a great emergency. "There's one thing, they're all in a better world now," said Miss Pendexter in a self-conscious and constrained voice. "They can't feel such little things or take note of slights same's we can." "No, I suppose 'tis myself that wants to be just," answered Mrs. Bickford. "I feel under obligations to my last husband when I look about and see how comfortable he left me. Poor Mr. Wallace had his great projects, and perhaps if he'd lived longer he'd have made a record. But when he died he'd failed all up, owing to that patent corn sheller he'd put everything into, and as you know, I had to get along a'most any way I could for the next few years. Life was very disappointing with Mr. Wallace, but he meant well, and used to be an amiable person to dwell with, until his temper got spoilt making so many hopes and having 'em turn out failures. He had considerable of an air, and dressed very handsome when I was first acquainted with him. Mr. Wallace did. I don't know's you ever knew Mr. Wallace in his prime." "He died the year I moved over here from North Denfield," said Miss Pendexter in a tone of sympathy. "I just knew him by sight. I was to his funeral. You know you lived in what we call the Wells house then, and I felt it wouldn't be an intrusion. We was such near neighbors. The first time I ever was in your house was just before that, when he was sick, and Mary Becca Wade and I called to see if there was anything we could do. They used to say about town that Mr. Wallace went to and fro like a mail coach and brought nothing to pass," announced Mrs. Bickford without bitterness. "He ought to have had a better chance than he did in this little neighborhood. You see, he had excellent ideas, but he never had learned the machinist's trade, and there was something the matter with every model he contrived. I used to be real narrow-minded when he talked about moving way up to Lowell, or some of them places. I hated to think of leaving my folks. And now I see that I never done right by him. His ideas was good. I know once he was on a jury, and there was a man stopping to the tavern where he was near the courthouse, a man that traveled for a firm to Lowell, and they engaged in talk, and Mr. Wallace let out some of his notions and contrivances, and he said that man wouldn't hardly stop to eat. He was so interested, and said he'd look for a chance for him up to Lowell. It all sounded so well that I kind of begun to think about going myself. Mr. Wallace said we'd close the house here and go and board through the winter, but he never heard a word from him, and the disappointment was one he never got over. I think of it now different from what I did then. I often used to be kind of disapproving to Mr. Wallace, but there he used to be always telling over his great projects. Somebody told me once that a man by the same name of the one he met while he was to court had got some patents for the very things Mr. Wallace used to be working over. But 'twas after he died, and I don't know's it was in him to ever really set things up so other folks could have seen their value. His machines always used to work kind of rickety, but folks used to come from all round to see 'em. They was curiosities if they want nothing else, and gave him a name." Mrs. Bickford paused a moment, with some geranium leaves in her hand, and seemed to suppress with difficulty a desire to speak even more freely. "He was a dreadful notional man," she said at last, regretfully, and as if this fact were a poor substitute for what had just been in her mind. "I recollect one time he worked all through the early winter over my churn, and got it so it would go 3/4 of an hour all of itself if you wound it up. And if you'll believe it, he went and spent all that time for nothing when the cow was dry, and we was with difficulty borrowing a pint of milk a day somewheres in the neighborhood just to get along with." Mrs. Bickford flushed with displeasure, and turned to look at her visitor. "Now, what do you think of such a man as that, Miss Pendexter?" she asked. "Why, I don't know but it was just as good for an invention," answered Miss Pendexter timidly, But her friend looked doubtful and did not appear to understand. Then I asked him where it was, one day that spring when I'd got tired to death churnin', and the butter wouldn't come in a churn I'd had to borrow, and he'd gone and took ours all to pieces to get the works to make some other useless contrivance with. He had no sort of a business turn, but he was well-meaning, Mr. Wallace was, and full of divertin' talk. They used to call him very good company. I see now that he never had no proper chance. I've always regretted Mr. Wallace, said she, who was now the widow Bickford. I'm sure you always speak well of him, said Miss Pendexter. 'Twas a pity he hadn't got among good businessmen, who could push his inventions and do all the business part. I was left very poor and needy for them next few years, said Mrs. Bickford mournfully, but he never'd give up but what he should die worth his $50,000. I don't see now how I ever did get along them next few years without him. But there, I always managed to keep a pig, and Sister Eliza gave me my potatoes, and I made out somehow. I could dig me a few greens, you know, in spring, and then it would come strawberry time and other berries a-followin' on. I was always decent to go to meat until within the last 6 months, and then I went in bad weather when folks wouldn't notice. But 'twas a rainy summer, and I managed to get considerable preachin' after all. My clothes looked proper enough when it was a wet Sabbath. I often think of them pinched days now, when I'm left so comfortable by Mr. Bickford. Yes'm, you've everything to be thankful for, said Miss Pendexter, who was as poor herself at that moment as her friend had ever been, and who could never dream of venturing upon the support and companionship of a pig. Mr. Bickford was a very personable man, she hastened to say. The confidences were so intimate and interesting. Oh, very, replied Mrs. Bickford. There was something about him that was very marked. Strangers would always ask who he was as he come into meetin'. His words counted. He never spoke except he had to. 'Twas a relief at first after Mr. Wallace's being so fluent, but Mr. Wallace was splendid company for winter evenings. 'Twould be 8 o'clock before you knew it. I didn't used to listen to it all, but he had a great deal of information. Mr. Bickford was dreadful dignified. I used to be sort of meechin' with him along at the first, for fear he'd disapprove of me. But I found out it wa'n't no need. He was always just that way, and done everything by rule and measure. He hadn't the mind of my other husbands, but he was a very dignified appearing man. He used most always to sleep in the evenin's, Mr. Bickford did. Them is lovely bouquets, certain, exclaimed Miss Pendexter. Why, I couldn't tell 'em apart. The flowers are coming out just right, aren't they? Mrs. Bickford nodded assent, and then, startled by sudden recollection, she cast a quick glance at the rose in the window. I always seem to forget about your first husband, Mr. Fraley, Miss Pendexter suggested bravely. I've often heard you speak of him, too, but he'd passed away long before I ever knew you. He was but a boy, said Mrs. Bickford. I thought the world was done for me when he died, but I've often thought since it was a mercy for him. He come of a very melancholy family, and all his brothers and sisters enjoyed poor health. It might have been his lot. Folks said we was as pretty a couple as ever come into church. We was both dark, with black eyes and a good deal of color. You wouldn't expect it to see me now. Albert was one that held up his head and looked as if he meant to own the town, and he had a good word for everybody. I don't know what the years might have brought. There was a long pause. Mrs. Bickford leaned over to pick up a heavy-headed guelder rose that had dropped on the floor. I expect it was what they call fallin' in love, she added in a different tone. He want nothing but a boy, and I want nothing but a girl, but we was dreadful happy. He didn't favor his folks. They all had hay-colored hair and was faded-looking, except his mother. They was alike and looked alike and said everything by each other. He was just the kind of strong, hearty young man that goes right off if they get a fever. We was just settled on a little farm, and he'd have done well if he'd had time. As it was, he left debts. He had a hasty temper, that was his great fault. But Albert had a lovely voice to sing. They said there wa'n't no such tenor voice in this part of the state. I could hear him singin' to himself right out in the field a-plowin' or hoein', and he didn't know it half of the time, no more'n a common bird would. I don't know's I valued his gift as I ought to, but there was nothing ever sounded so sweet to me. I ain't one that ever had much fancy, but I knowed Albert had a pretty voice." Mrs. Bickford's own voice trembled a little, but she held up the last bouquet and examined it critically. "I must hurry now and put these in water," she said, in a matter-of-fact tone. Little Miss Pendexter was so quiet and sympathetic that her hostess felt no more embarrassed than if she had been talking only to herself. "Yes, they do seem to droop some. 'Tis a little warm for them here in the sun," said Miss Pendexter, "but you'll find they'll all come up if you give them their fill of water. They'll look very handsome tomorrow. Folks'll notice them from the road. You've arranged them very tasty, Miss Bickford." "They do look pretty, don't they?" Mrs. Bickford regarded the three in turn. "I want to have them all pretty. You may deem it strange, Abby." "Why, no, Miss Bickford," said the guest sincerely, although a little perplexed by the solemnity of the occasion. "I know how it is with friends, that having one don't keep you from wanting another. 'Tis just like having something to eat, and then wanting something to drink just the same. I expect all friends find their places." But Mrs. Bickford was not interested in this figure, and still looked vague and anxious as she began to brush the broken stems and wilted leaves into her wide calico apron. "I done the best I could while they was alive," she said, "and mourned 'em when I lost 'em, and I feel grateful to be left so comfortable now when all is over. It seems foolish, but I'm still at a loss about that rose." "Perhaps you'll feel sure when you first wake up in the morning," answered Miss Pendexter solicitously. "It's a case where I don't deem myself qualified to offer you any advice, but I'll say one thing, seeing's you've been so friendly spoken and confiding with me. I never was married myself, Miss Bickford, because it wa'n't so that I could have the one I liked." "I suppose he ain't livin' then?" "Why, I wa'n't never aware you had met with a disappointment, Abby," said Mrs. Bickford instantly. None of her neighbors had ever suspected little Miss Pendexter of a romance. "Yes'm, he's livin'," replied Miss Pendexter humbly. "No'm, I never have heard that he died." "I want to know!" exclaimed the woman of experience. "Well, I'll tell you this, Abby. You may have regretted your lot, and felt lonesome and hardshipped, but they all have their faults, and a single woman's got her liberty, if she ain't got other blessin's." "'Twouldn't have been my choice to live alone," said Abby, meeker than before. "I feel very thankful for my blessin's all the same. You've always been a kind neighbor, Miss Bickford." "Why can't you stop to tea?" asked the elder woman with unusual cordiality. But Miss Pendexter remembered that her hostess often expressed a dislike for unexpected company, and promptly took her departure after she had risen to go, glancing up at the bright flower as she passed outside the window. It seemed to belong most to Albert, but she had not liked to say so. The sun was low. The green fields stretched away southward into the misty distance. Mrs. Bickford's house appeared to watch her out of sight down the road the next morning. She had lost all spirit for her holiday. Perhaps it was the unusual excitement of the afternoon's reminiscences, or it might have been simply the bright moonlight night which had kept her broad awake until dawn, thinking of the past, and more concerned about the rose. By this time it had ceased to be merely a flower, and had become a definite symbol and assertion of personal choice. She found it very difficult to decide. So much of her present comfort and well-being was due to Mr. Bickford. Still, it was Mr. Wallace who had been most unfortunate, and to whom she had done least justice. If she owed recognition to Mr. Bickford, she certainly owed amends to Mr. Wallace. If she gave him the rose, it would be for the sake of affectionate apology. And then there was Albert, to whom she had no thought of being either indebted or forgiving. But she could not escape from the terrible feeling of indecision. It was a beautiful morning for a drive, but Mrs. Bickford was kept waiting some time for the chaise. Her nephew, who was to be her escort, had found much social advantage at the blacksmith shop, so that it was after 10 when she finally started with the 3 large flat-backed bouquets, covered with a newspaper to protect them from the sun. The petals of the almond flowers were beginning to scatter, and now and then little streams of water leaked out of the newspaper and trickled down the steep slope of her best dress to the bottom of the chaise. Even yet, she had not made up her mind. She had stopped trying to deal with such an evasive thing as decision, and leaned back and rested as best she could. What an old fool I be!" She rebuked herself from time to time in so loud a whisper that her companion ventured a respectful, "What, ma'am?" and was astonished that she made no reply. John was a handsome young man, but Mrs. Bickford could never cease thinking of him as a boy. He had always been her favorite among the younger members of the family, and now returned this affectionate feeling, being possessed of an instinctive confidence in the sincerities of his prosaic aunt. As they drove along, there had seemed at first to be something unsympathetic and garish about the beauty of the summer day. After the shade and shelter of the house, Mrs. Bickford suffered even more from a contracted and assailed feeling out of doors. The very trees by the roadside had a curiously fateful, trying way of standing back to watch her as she passed in the acute agony of indecision, and she was annoyed and startled by a bird that flew too near the chaise in a moment of surprise. She was conscious of a strange reluctance to the movement of the Sunday chaise, as if she were being conveyed against her will. But the companionship of her nephew John grew every moment to be more and more a reliance. It was very comfortable to sit by his side, even though he had nothing to say. He was manly and cheerful, and she began to feel protected. "Aunt Bickford," he suddenly announced, "I may's well out with it. I've got a piece of news to tell you if you won't let on to nobody. I expect you'll laugh, but you know I've said everything by Mary Lizzie Gifford ever since I was a boy." "Well, sir?" "Well, sir," exclaimed Aunt Bickford in her turn, quickly roused into most comfortable self-forgetfulness, "I am really pleased. She'll make you a good smart wife, John. Ain't all the folks pleased, both sides?" "Yes, they be," answered John soberly, with a happy, important look that became him well. "I guess I can make out to do something for you to help along when the right time comes," said Aunt Bickford impulsively after a moment's reflection. "I've known what it is to be starting out in life with plenty of hope. You ain't calculating on getting married before fall, or be ye?" "Long in the fall," said John regretfully. "I wish we could set up for ourselves right away this summer. I ain't got much ahead, but I can work well as anybody, and now I'm out of my time." "She's a nice, modest, pretty girl. I thought she liked you, John," said the old aunt. "I saw her over to your mother's last day I was there. Well, I expect you'll be happy." "Certain," said John, turning to look at her affectionately, surprised by this outspokenness and lack of embarrassment between them. "Thank you, Aunt," he said simply. "You're a real good friend to me." And he looked away again hastily, and blushed a fine scarlet over his sun-browned face. "She's coming over to spend the day with the girls," he added. "Mother thought of it. You don't get over to see us very often." Mrs. Bickford smiled approvingly. John's mother looked for her good opinion, no doubt, but it was very proper for John to have told his prospects himself, and in such a pretty way. There was no shilly-shallying about the boy. "My gracious," said John suddenly, "I'd like to have drove right by the burying ground. I forgot we wanted to stop." Strange as it may appear, Mrs. Bickford herself had not noticed the burying ground either, in her excitement and pleasure. Now she felt distressed and responsible again, and showed it in her face at once. The young man leaped lightly to the ground and reached for the flowers. "Here, you just let me run up with 'em," he said kindly. "'Tis hot in the sun today, and you'll mind it risin' the hill. We'll stop as I fetch you back tonight, and you can go up comfortable and walk the yard after sundown when it's cool, and stay as long as you're a mind to. You seem sort of tired, Aunt." "I don't know but what I will let you carry him," said Mrs. Bickford slowly. To leave the matter of the rose in the hands of fate seemed weakness and cowardice, but there was not a moment for consideration. John was a smiling fate, and his proposition was a great relief. She watched him go away with a terrible inward shaking and sinking of pride. She had held the flowers with so firm a grasp that her hands felt weak and numb, and as she leaned back and shut her eyes, she was afraid to open them again at first for fear of knowing the bouquets apart even at that distance, and giving instructions which she might regret. With a sudden impulse she called John once or twice eagerly, but her voice had a thin and piping sound, and the meditative early crickets that chirped in the fresh summer grass probably sounded louder in John's ears. The bright light on the white stones dazzled Mrs. Bickford's eyes, and then all at once she felt light-hearted, and the sky seemed to lift itself higher and wider from the earth. And she gave a sigh of relief as her messenger came back along the path. "I know who I do, hope's got the right one," she said to herself. "There, what a touse I be in. I don't see what I had to go and pick the old rose for anyway." "I declare they did look real handsome, Aunt," said John's hearty voice as he approached the chaise. "I set 'em up just as you told me. This one fell out, and I kept it. I don't know's you'll care. I can give it to Lizzie." He faced her now with a bright, boyish look. There was something gay in his buttonhole. It was the red rose. Aunt Bickford blushed like a girl. "Your choice is easy made," she faltered mysteriously, and then burst out laughing, there in front of the burying ground. "Come, get right in, dear," she said. "Well, well, I guess the rose was made for you. It looks very pretty in your coat, John." She thought of Albert, and the next moment the tears came into her old eyes. John was a lover, too. "My first husband was just such a tall, straight young man as you be," she said as they drove along. "The flower he first give me was a rose." Oh, 1 Pro.